This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that absorbed pressure for so long that it forgot how to say no. What you saw was not chaos. It was resistance. Quiet, delayed, and finally, visible. For years, institutions learned to bend instead of break, to wait, to de-escalate, to absorb disruption as the cost of stability. Until one room, one moment, when the system reached its limit, and when that limit was crossed, something rare happened. Authority stopped negotiating. Rules stopped being symbolic. Power stopped being impressed by power. If you think this is just a dramatic scene, stay with me. Because what matters is not what happened. That's why it took this long. That delay tells us something unsettling about how the system really works now. And once you see it, you can't unsee where this is heading. What actually controls the system now is not law. And it's not personality either. It's tolerance. How much disruption an institution is willing to absorb before it acts. How long rules are treated as suggestions. How often authority waits, hoping behavior corrects itself. Over time, that tolerance becomes the system. Courts are built to be boring, procedural, predictable. But when defiance is repeated and unanswered, something subtle shifts. Power stops flowing from rules. It starts flowing from who can force a reaction, not who is right, who is loud, who creates cost by refusing to comply. That's the recalibration most people miss. This wasn't about decorum. It was about whether the courtroom still set the terms, or whether the defendant did. For a long time, the system tried not to escalate. Warnings, pauses, restraint. That restraint felt responsible until it wasn't, because every delayed response trained everyone watching on what was possible. And that training didn't stay in that room. It moved forward. What changed was not sudden. That's the danger. Before, disruption was corrected immediately. Rules were enforced early. Authority was boring, but absolute. Now, defiance is managed, negotiated, endured. What once would have stopped a proceeding now stretches it. Interruptions become background noise. Challenges become expected friction. And slowly, the meaning of order shifts. In the past, a courtroom controlled behavior. Now, behavior tests the courtroom, not with violence, with persistence, week after week, interruption after interruption. Each one small enough to excuse, together impossible to ignore. This is how normalization works. Nothing breaks all at once. It erodes. The system convinces itself it is being patient, professional, above the conflict. But patience has a cost. Every unanswered challenge teaches a lesson, not just to the person doing it, but to everyone watching. It teaches where the line really is. And eventually, someone crosses it, not by accident, but because the system trained them to try. That crossing was inevitable. And once it happened, there was no quiet way back. The shock wasn't the argument. It was the intervention. Because courts almost never do this. Warnings come first, then more warnings, then recesses, then patience. What happened here skipped to the end. A judge stopped the proceeding, not symbolically. Physically, officers stepped forward, the room froze. Lawyers stopped writing. The gallery went silent. This was not performance. This was containment. Removal is the option courts reserve for one thing only: when the process itself is under threat. Not feelings, not optics, function. What made this moment destabilizing wasn't who was removed. It was why. Repeated defiance, ignored rulings. Direct confrontation. The court concluded something critical had already been lost. Control. If that sounds extreme, it should. Because this is the judiciary admitting that ordinary tools no longer worked. If you're still watching, you already sense it. This wasn't discipline, it was damage control. And the most important question isn't why the judge acted. It's why the system waited until it had no other choice. Because once authority has to announce itself this loudly, something else has already failed. Here's the part most people miss. The system didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it was designed to absorb pressure quietly. Judicial authority works best when it doesn't have to be seen. Compliance is assumed, order is ambient, but when defiance becomes strategy, the mechanism changes. Every interruption forces a choice: respond and escalate, or tolerate and preserve calm. Tolerance feels neutral. It isn't. It shifts the burden. The court absorbs delay. The public absorbs confusion. The institution absorbs doubt. Meanwhile, the disruptor gains leverage simply by refusing to stop. This is the hidden mechanism. Disruption creates cost. Silence pays it. The longer the system waits, the higher the price of enforcement becomes. Until enforcement itself looks extreme. That's how power flips. Not suddenly, incrementally. By the time the judge acted, the damage was already done. The system was no longer correcting behavior. It was defending itself. And when institutions move from governance to self-preservation, everything accelerates. Because now, every future interaction carries history, suspicion, shorter fuses. This wasn't a reset. It was a threshold crossing, and once crossed, the system cannot return to how it operated before. Then everything sped up. Shorter warnings, less patience, no room for theatrics. What had been tolerated before was now documented, logged, remembered. Every movement mattered. Every word carried consequence. Because once a system asserts itself physically, it cannot pretend neutrality anymore. This is where escalation lives. Not in shouting, in compression. Timelines tighten. Flexibility disappears. Discretion narrows. What used to be negotiable becomes binary. Comply or be removed. This isn't about punishment. It's about risk management. The court has already decided what it cannot allow. Again, loss of control. That decision follows every future hearing, every ruling, every pause. And here's the destabilizing truth. Acceleration doesn't feel dramatic at first. It feels procedural until suddenly options are gone. Appeals shrink. Delays fail. Tolerance evaporates. This is how systems harden. Quietly. Relentlessly. The spectacle already happened. What follows won't be visible, but it will be faster, sharper, and far less forgiving. Because once authority stops absorbing disruption, it doesn't go back, and that puts pressure somewhere else. On people, this is where it reaches you. Not as a headline, as a temperature change. When institutions harden, they don't announce it. They transmit it. You feel it in shorter hearings. Stricter enforcement, less room for explanation. What used to be flexible becomes final. If you've ever relied on patience from a system, a court, an agency, a process, that patience just got rarer. Because once authority decides it has waited too long, it doesn't widen access. It narrows it. Efficiency replaces discretion. Speed replaces empathy. And here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't targeted. It's contagious. The tools used to regain control don't stay attached to one case. They become precedent. They become posture. If this feels distant, don't look at the defendant. Look at the system learning to protect itself. If you want to understand what kind of environment that creates next, stay with me. Because this shift doesn't stop at one courtroom. It ripples outward, upward, and eventually back toward the public. What happened didn't stay contained because systems watch each other. International media didn't focus on the personality. They focused on the response. A former head of state physically removed by a court enforcing order, that image traveled not as spectac, as signal to other judiciaries, other governments, other institutions under pressure from powerful individuals who test limits. the message wasn't triumph, it was strain. This is what it looks like when authority waits too long and then has to act visibly. All over the world, courts face the same dilemma: enforce early and risk backlash, or delay and risk collapse of credibility. This moment became a reference point, proof that even mature democracies are being stress tested. Not by coups, by defiance normalized over time. And once a system shows it can be forced into dramatic enforcement, others recalibrate. Some tighten rules preemptively. Some hesitate longer. Some politicize the response. None are unaffected. Because this wasn't local misbehavior. It was a global lesson about what happens when institutions delay drawing lines. And the lesson is unfinished. Because the hardest part isn't restoring order. It's deciding what comes next. Now we're at the fork. From here, the system has three paths. None are clean. The first is adjustment. Institutions learn, they enforce earlier, they tighten boundaries before pressure builds. This path looks stable, but it comes with cost. Less flexibility, less grace. More friction up front. The second is erosion. Rules exist, but enforcement becomes inconsistent. Authority is asserted only when absolutely necessary. This path feels familiar, manageable, until it isn't. Because erosion doesn't collapse systems, it hollows them out. Trust thins. Compliance becomes optional. Every actor starts calculating how far they can go. Then there is rupture. That's when enforcement arrives suddenly and universally. Not calibrated, not gradual. When authority reasserts itself everywhere at once because it waited too long anywhere. History shows this pattern. Delay, tolerance, abrupt correction. Which path comes next isn't decided by one judge or one case. It's decided by how much strain the system absorbs before it acts again. And that question is still open, which is why the most dangerous part of this story hasn't happened yet. Nothing has been resolved. That's the mistake people make. They see enforcement and assume closure. They see authority and assume stability. But systems don't reset after moments like this. They remember them. Every future decision now carries a shadow. Every warning weighs more. Every act of defiance costs more. Not because anyone wants it to, because the system has learned what delay produces. This moment wasn't about winning or losing. It was about exposure. Exposure of how much pressure institutions were already under. Exposure of how visible enforcement becomes when quiet control fails. If you're still here, don't look for comfort. Look for patterns, because this won't be the last time authority has to announce itself. And the next time, the response may come faster, sharper, with less room to pull back. If you want to understand where this leads, you'll have to keep watching. Keep questioning. Keep tracking when systems stop absorbing strain and start transferring it. This story doesn't end here. It continues in the next moment when restraint runs out again. And when it does, the consequences won't ask for permission.